Hi, this is Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. So, someone wrote in and asked me if I would speak on the subject of death, grief, loss, um, where animals go when they die, that whole nutshell there. And so I've been thinking about it for the last week and trying to figure out exactly, well, I never know exactly what I'm going to say, but to figure out a way to start at any rate. And first off, um, I've been very fortunate in this life. I have not lost a family member, someone I'm close to. I mean, my grandmother and grandfather passed away, but I wasn't really close to them. And I have two aunts and an uncle who have passed, but I wasn't close to them either. I mean, since I moved away from where on the East Coast most of the family resided, I didn't have much interaction with the family and to get away from them. But I've been with people who have lost someone close to them and seen how they feel, what they've gone through, and my mother's told me how what happened to her and that kind of thing. So I think first off, I'll talk about those things that I've experienced through others because grief is a different animal, I think, for everyone, depending on how you felt about the person, whether you were close to them or not close to them, whether you had things that were unresolved between you or not. It sort of colors the entire range of emotional responses that you might get. So, my second husband, Rick, his father died, and I just knew that he was going to be upset about that. I had told you briefly about the experience of my first uh, like becoming a medium and some other spirit talked through me was my second husband's grandmother who was coming to tell us that his father was going to die soon. And indeed, it was like 3 months or so later that he passed. And and he was definitely very emotional about it, and I was just very supportive. And in retrospect, it was a very odd thing. Um, like I like to sing. I'm a good singer, have been in the past at any rate. And when I went to the funeral, his funeral, and they were having us sing the songs and stuff, being an empath, I felt all the feelings and was crying while I was singing. And Rick was suspicious of me because I was able to sing while I was crying. So I think that was something else, not about grief. It was just about, he had a lot of suspicions about me that he thought were then confirmed much later down the road when we were, getting a divorce. Um, but that was just sort of an odd thing that he mentioned at the time. So with that one, there wasn't much that happened in the core. He didn't seem to be very devastated for very long. We ended up getting his father's house. The main problems we had with that particular death had to do around the actions of his aunt and uncle, his father's brother and sister, and their sudden need to steal things from the house that they thought that they deserved. Death can do strange things to people. Uh, and that was the first time I witnessed that. I was kind of like taken aback because it never dawned on me that family would start coming over and fighting. His sister, actually, when she came, did not go to the funeral. She stayed at the house and robbed the house while we were at the funeral of all these small portable antiques that she could fit into the empty suitcase that she brought with her. So clearly, this was a plan. And she even removed a table and chairs. There was a Queen Anne table and chair set in the basement, and got a neighbor of ours to assist her in taking it up the stairs and hiding it in his apartment until she sent him money to have it shipped. That was like the oddest thing. And then his uncle, the brother, came over and started, I was by myself and started yelling at me, wanting to know what we'd hid. So, and he almost pushed me down a flight of stairs. I had to call the police to get him out of there. So that was a wake up call, just on how volatile some people can get when there is a death in the family, and just something to be aware of if you haven't gone through it yet and you haven't met those kinds of people. You never know. I've met, I don't know how many people since that have had similar experiences with family once someone's gone. Like there was an elderly couple, and the husband died, and then the family came over to take stuff even though the wife was still alive. It's like, yeah, people are strange. Some of the things are very incomprehensible to me. And that, in a sense, is a grief response, I'm assuming. Maybe it's larceny, I don't know. Or they feel justified because the person is gone. I don't know what's going on in their heads. But death in a family can do strange things to members of the family, and that is one that I've seen. My mother, when her father died, he was the death was expected. He'd been sick for a long time. He had cancer. He was given like 3 months to live, and he lasted for about 8 years after he got the 3 month death sentence. And we're a stubborn family, and then, yeah, up until the end, very stubborn. And my mother had a very odd reaction to his death when she went there and got the news and stuff, and she went to her mother's house. Um, she concocted this fantasy in her head that he wasn't dead, that he was being held captive in the basement of the hospital, and they were doing medical experiments upon him, and she needed to go rescue him. And my mother is not prone to delusional thinking. She's pretty grounded generally, and so this was a big shock to her that she had this total delusion, in an attempt to try and avoid accepting his death. She had no idea that she would react that way. And that's the other thing, is grief is different for everyone. You never know for sure how it's going to manifest itself. There's no real roadmap to it because we're all individuals and our brains are wired in different ways, and you know, you just don't know for sure. And I was glad she told me about this anyway later. And so when they took her to the funeral parlor to view my grandfather, as they had him in an open casket, she would start to go through the doors of the funeral home and then find herself back outside. Her body kept turning her around and taking her outside. And it took her, she thought, about 5 times to actually get through the door. And I'm sure that's because on some level her body or subconscious or whatever knew that once she saw his body, then the delusion would be gone. And then she'd have to face the reality of what had happened. And eventually she did get in, and as soon as she saw him, it did. It just was gone. And so it was very interesting for me to hear about that because, not having had much experience directly myself, I needed to know it's important to know these things and to share this information with each other. So should something happen, you have something to fall back on. And that piece of information turned out to be extremely helpful for me when Ian's brother was killed. And the whole situation was interesting in the fact that we moved out here and hadn't had any contact with the family for 8 or 9 years, I think. I think it'd been about 9 years. And then all of a sudden the phone rings and it's family, and they're calling to tell us that his brother has died and the funeral is going to be this coming weekend. Um, and Ian was in absolute shock for several reasons. One, he had never intended to break off contact with his brother when we left. It was to get away from his mother because she, was psychotic and schizophrenic, and he needed to get away from her so he could start becoming himself. I thought it was very important for us to leave, and I was glad that the universe agreed and arranged for us to move a few hundred miles away. Um, and the fact that he was now gone, it's like we hold within ourselves dream potential, or the idea of what's going to happen in the future. It's not just with loved ones, well, not just in this kind of circumstance, but it's true of relationships as well. So in our minds, we have built a future with someone. Things, time has passed. Like with a family member, we've gotten back together. We've been able to look back and share, what had happened and why we lost touch with each other and all this other stuff. In his case, or in the case of a relationship, we make plans to go on trips. We've got a dream for buying a place together, doing something, having children, whatever it might be, and then when it stops, whether it's a physical death or the death of an idea in the sense that the marriage that you went into or relationship you went into is now coming to an end, then all those feelings and all those thoughts and energy that we've put into potential in the future now has to be reassessed, re-examined, and then gotten rid of. And that becomes a process of grief as well, because it is a death of the possibilities of the future. And so that was the first thing that hit Ian, was the death of all potential for the future of getting back together with his brother, and and so forth. And I have never seen him. Apparently, thinking about it makes me want to cry. I've never seen him cry like that. He was so incredibly broken, and the intense sobbing he went through. And there's nothing I could do. I couldn't bring his brother back. All I could do was be there and hug him and let him cry. And sometimes that's all you can do. There's no magic fix for death. No matter what our belief system is, when someone leaves this plane, we can't talk to them in person anymore. We can't touch them. We have to find alternative means to process if we need to with them. But there is a hole in the world, and that's what death brings to the living. It doesn't bother the dead in general, but it definitely bothers the living. And so we got this news probably about 4 or so in the afternoon, and he was absolutely frantic, and he started talking crazy. He started talking about, he was confident that this was a plot that his mother had cooked up in order to get him there, and that once we went, we would find out that indeed that's not what was going on at all. And I was pretty sure that wasn't the case, since I was on the outside of this grief intense mental bubble that he had. But I also knew from what my mother said that this wasn't abnormal. That was important. That this was a temporary insanity, and that so long as I was there and was with him and was supportive and was like constant and so forth, I was pretty confident that he would get past it. But we were going to have to be there in person for it to happen. And so he was starting to calm down. It was getting close to midnight. And then he got on the computer. And the local newspaper had posted an article about the last moments of his brother's death. He was killed in a horrific car accident. And after the first part of it, he was still alive, and he was trapped in the middle of the road screaming for help when he got hit by the next vehicle that killed him. And then all of the suppositions that the people who were there started to formulate about what had happened. They decided that he did it on purpose because he had swerved across the road and then swerved back, that he was trying to commit suicide by vehicle. I'm confident that that's not correct. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. We did not know that yet. He had been given medication for his condition that made him sleep like 20 plus hours a day. So staying awake was extremely difficult. He was on a road on the way to see his son and his ex-wife. So I think it was a combination of the medication and stuff like that, and it just made him not capable of driving. It was undoubtedly a very bad idea. However, these are details that my husband will never be able to get out of his mind forever, although he doesn't dwell on it at this point. And the horror of him reading and finding out about this on an article that was supposedly an article of journalism, I was appalled. I really was. And in the media, I see this kind of thing happen, the suppositions that start when a story breaks and people are deciding what they think this might mean and all this other stuff, which isn't helpful in any way, sense, or form, because although we would like to know what's really going on, it's better to find out what actually happened or not need to know the excruciating and grotesque details, um, especially for those people that have actually lost the person that they're talking about. So I really think about those who are left behind when I read articles about people who've died and in whatever way they've died, and I would never add to that kind of a energy. Just completely unnecessary, and yet it happens constantly. They're at least a little bit better about not showing us the exact moment of someone's demise on TV. The first time they did that, I was completely and totally in shock. Watching the news, they were talking about a forest fire. There was a plane, was one of the planes that dumped water or chemicals on the fire, and then it crashed into the fire, and everyone on board was killed. And they showed it to us, and I was just like screaming. I was like, what the hell? Why did you show me that? They have since stopped doing that kind of thing. They like stopped just before it happens so you can imagine it but not have to see it. I don't know if that's any better, but it is a little bit better, at least for people like us or me and whatnot. And I think that even when death is expected, like with my mother's father, it's still a shock to the system for a lot of people because of that sudden void, like a place where a person's voice and interaction lives is now become vacant because there's no way to reestablish connection on this plane with that. So I think that funerals and stuff like that are for the living, not for the dead, and that they're important rituals to help the living, and some of them are so horrific I don't understand why they would ever do it. And that was an experience that I had, the manipulation of the emotional um, interactions and things like that are flying around that unscrupulous funeral parlor directors can tap into and then really, put the screws to them. I had a friend in high school. He fancied himself a wizard. I think he was a year above me, or maybe he was in the same year. He must have been in the same year. And his sister died in a horrific car accident. It was a convertible, so it wasn't really visually able to put her back together, because it was, yeah, she was pretty shattered. And for some unknown reason to me, the funeral home had an open casket, but they put like a sort of thick purple veil across the top so you couldn't actually see her very much. She was going to get married the following week, so they buried her in her wedding dress and her ring. Her fiance was actually driving the car when it happened. He had a broken leg. They put him in the front on the floor, and they put her on the stage, and they put the family on the stage uh, with her. The mother and father and siblings, like my friend. And I only went there because of my friend. I thought I should go there to help support him. And yeah, and then they read her wedding vows as part of the eulogy, and the fiance started screaming. and crying, and it should have been me, and he's on crutches and he's hobbling down the aisle, and I'm like beside myself. Was me and my mother and my youngest sister went, and we're crying. We don't know these people at all. We're crying like crazy, and then they closed the casket in front of the family, and the mother leaped on the casket and started clawing at it and screaming, "Don't take my child away from me." I mean, I considered this was a horror show. I had no idea that they could do that in a funeral. And there are some traditions where trying to really ramp up the emotional intensity is what the culture is looking for, because the idea of crying and screaming and releasing the grief is part of what they're going for. And I understand that, but I was horrified by this. And that made me decide at the moment then and there that I was going to be cremated, because I never wanted someone to be able to use my body to torture the people that I'd left behind. It was just a horrible, horrible thing. So I'm glad that funeral services are changing, that organizations are coming up and they're doing more celebrations of life, which makes more sense to me, because, remembering how someone was seems like it'd be more healing. Although this other form might be very cathartic, I don't know that it's really healthy and useful in the long run. I don't know. But it's not something I would ever do. So when it comes to paganism in general, it's like everything else. All pagans have got a different idea of what the afterlife might look like. Some pagans believe in the Summerlands, which we had a whole episode about that and found out what the Summerlands really were, which was not what we thought. But now, at any rate, they're considered like this wonderful perpetual summer where you go and just really enjoy yourself and then come back if you've decided you believe in reincarnation, or stay there and just enjoy yourself if not. And my feelings about the other side, because of the spirits that I've crossed over who've been stuck here, and that each one so far has had their very own version of heaven. And I have past life memories that tell me that as well. So, I believe that is the case, that we end up where we're expecting to be, where we believe we belong. And that's why it's important to do the work and work on your subconscious, because it's your subconscious that's going to be writing that. It's going to be steering the boat when you leave your body and go. So, all of the stories about the wonderful places people might be are to make us feel better, because there's really no actual evidence to prove it one way or the other, including, all of my experiences, although they have a definite consistency and they're different depending on the ethnicity and religion of the person I'm crossing over. So, I'm confident in that. Doesn't mean that it's correct and that I know what I'm talking about. It's just these are my experiences, and the evidence seems to be leaning in that direction. So, one of the things that we can do from a magical perspective, that's what we do on Samhain. That's what the Feasts of the Dead are all about. It's an opportunity to sort of reestablish at least a brief relationship with the person who's gone, and then get out what you need to get out, whatever that happens to be. Whether you need to, be mad at them and process that. Somebody dying can make a lot of people angry. I've seen people that got very angry at the person who died. Some of the people I work on in my massage office have lost their partners of many years, and it's not uncommon for me to see them go through a definite series of rage moments, like, why didn't they take better care of themselves, and they left me here to try and figure things out on my own, and they knew what they were doing was slowly killing them, but they did it anyway. And so I think that anger is not an uncommon reaction to loss, and it's just sort of the prelude to the other parts of grief. It's like, anger is one side of the coin and grief and loss is the other. They're sort of the same energy in this case, but one is outward, focused outward, and the other is focused inward. And sometimes we try to maintain that outward focus as long as we can because we don't want to turn it around and have to face it inward, because then, reality sets in. That's what you can call it. So that's another thing. Um, and that also happens with people who have near death experiences. I've met people who've not had a good time. They didn't want to come back, and they came back mad because they were without pain and without anything that was bothering them, and then they got pulled back into a body that was racked with pain and had to have surgery to repair it and have another years of pain in order to recover from that. And so, being all different, there are a lot of different kinds of reactions that we can have um, to death. And believing in reincarnation doesn't make killing someone good just because they might come back. I mean, I've actually heard people rationalize activities that way, where it's like, seriously, I'm sorry, just because they're going to come back doesn't mean you didn't just kill them and interfere with whatever's going to happen in their life this time around. And so that doesn't mean you didn't murder them, because if their spirit is everlasting, you took away their body and they still have to get a new house, not okay. So, so on Samhain and the Feast of the Dead and dumb suppers and stuff like that, that's one of the things that we do to try and help us process a loss, um, and to complete something that feels incomplete. And people's responses to it, okay, so my father died, and I was relieved. You know by now that he tortured me a lot. And culturally, it's not acceptable response to be happy when your father passes away. It's, it's kind of interesting. And that culture thing, it's not just with that. It's like you see it in TV shows. I see it in TV shows where someone says, "Oh, your father is sick. You need to go visit him in the hospital," or your mother or whoever. Well, I don't want to because they were mean to me. Well, if they die, then you're going to regret it. It's like, excuse me? Who the hell do you think you are? It's none of your business. Never tell someone that they need to go do something like that in order to complete themselves, or to, forgiveness is not something that should just be handed out like a get out of hell free card. I don't know. And you don't have to forgive people who've wronged you. Just because they died doesn't mean they didn't still harm you. I don't believe in that kind of forgiveness. I believe in giving them the responsibility. Um, because my sister forgave my father and agreed to never speak of the past again, which I didn't think was a healthy reaction, because how can you forgive someone who did all that to you? And people often say you need to forgive in order to move forward, or if you don't forgive, then hate is going to consume you and you're only harming yourself. And that's not necessarily true either, except in the words that people tell you and that people say to you. And in the religion, honor thy father and thy mother. It's like, I'm sorry, there's nothing here to honor. And but I was surprised at how relieved I felt when my father passed. It was a huge relief, and I realized that I had been watching for him since I last saw him when I was 17, I think. Last time I saw him, he molested me in public, so great memory to hold on to, right? And and I didn't realize until he was gone that I had been watching for him every time I saw any men in any crowd, anywhere. I would be scanning every single one of their faces very carefully to look for similarities between their face and my father's face, because he was still alive and he might come after me. And so it was interesting how that shifted and how good that was for me when he passed. It was like this huge weight, and it allowed me to move forward. And that was just before Ian and I got together. He passed the year before we met. So he passed in 1990. And, some people were annoyed and angry at me because I was relieved that my father had died. People who knew me well, though, were just as happy that he had passed. And what I did, of course, magically, was to force him to stay for a period of time and listen, because that was the thing he never did, was accept responsibility for anything he did. But it was also, before that happened, I gave him back the things he was responsible for, and I decided that forgiveness was not my responsibility. I didn't need to learn how to forgive him. He was responsible for figuring it out and learning how to forgive himself, because he was the one who was in control. So that's just that little piece. I guess I have had a little experience with it. My mother went to the funeral to make sure he was really dead. She said it was to support my brother and my sister. And I said, yeah, but you really went there to make sure he was really dead. She says, you're right. That's what I did. I did that. So depending on what kind of a relationship you've had with the person, you can have a wide range of responses to them passing, depending on how well you knew them, how good the relationship was, and all that other stuff. So there's no one single way. So for people who weren't there when someone passed that they were close to, they often feel like there's a hole in them, like the hole we were talking about earlier. Once the person is gone, it's like there's a hole where they used to be, and it feels incomplete, like there's no way for them to finish that because that energy is now gone. They can't access it. Which is one of the reasons why, we often write letters to the dead, so we can express how we feel. Sit down in a circle in a ritual and read the letter aloud, so that you can externalize the feelings from yourself and get them out into the universe, which is one of the reasons why I like speaking in ritual, is because there's power in putting that out of you, especially when it comes to that kind of processing. And then burning the letter so it goes to somewhere we can't go. It becomes this smoke and this mist and whatever, and it goes to the other side. And crying is important. Crying is a way for us to move energy through our bodies and to let those things out. Different kinds of tears have different kinds of chemical compositions. I know sweat does. When I lived up north, one of the bushmen I was involved with told me that if he was angry when he was out in the woods working and was sweating, and the black flies would come along, or other flies or whatever, and drink his sweat, if he was angry, they would die. And if he wasn't angry, they wouldn't. And so there's an actual change in the chemistry of our fluid depending on how we're feeling. And so it's a way to externalize those things so they don't get bottled up in us and cause us harm. It's a good thing to do. But certainly, if you're going through something like that, and in this time at the moment with the pandemic that we're in, and so many people have passed unexpectedly, there's a lot of grief out there in all of our communities, and a lot of sudden grief. And then in the midst of it, you still have to try and maintain, distance and safety and all this other stuff, and it's a very intense time on that level. And so, a lot of people are having to figure out how to deal with this, and they never thought they would have to this quickly. Entire families have been wiped out. It's just horrible. So, certainly grief counseling is important if you can get it. I guess they can do that on Zoom or whatever. Being able to talk to someone in the family that knows the person, processing that. If you're on the outs with the person who has passed, then you're left with different devices, like I was talking about. And shared grief seems to be less intense. It was very exhausting for me as the support person when Ian's brother died, because he wasn't capable of doing anything except being in grief at the time. So I had to arrange for where we were going to go. I called his friends that were in the area still, to see if I could get some people that knew him to be there at the funeral. I had to drive us all the way over there, and it's like, 4.5 hours each way. His mother was her usual delightful self and wanted to know if he was still evil in the midst of his grief, and we had to leave because I wasn't going to sit there and watch him be abused by her. And it's like, and he told him, he says, "If you keep this up, I'm going to have to grieve. I'm going to have to leave. We're here for my brother." And she couldn't stop because she's that kind of schizophrenia. It's like once she got an idea, it kind of wormed its way around and got a groove and never left because she's been thinking this since he was 12. This has been a long time. So there's always the potential for that kind of stuff. So, and it's hard on the people that are having to help. Like I was saying, it definitely was difficult for me emotionally and physically. When we finally got through it, of course, when we got to the graveyard and the service started, all the thoughts and ideas he had about this being not true instantly vanished, as I figured they would. So I don't know how much of that he actually remembers at this point. So, so the writing things down and reading them aloud, taking those special moments. That's one of the reasons why people have cemeteries and stuff and go and talk to the gravestone, even if no one is in it. They have it's a place. It's like a placeholder for them to put all of their energy and so forth. And so, depending on where you live and what kind of culture you're in, there's going to be a lot of different kinds of funeral processes that you might go through. I personally believe in reincarnation or don't believe in reincarnation because I remember my other lives. Belief really requires a leap of faith, and I don't have to make a leap of faith. I just knew these things when I was born. But, not everybody does. And just because someone might be reincarnated doesn't mean you miss them less or that it hurts less or anything like that. It can sometimes help in the long run, maybe. Yeah, so I think that those, remembrance services and things are important for those who are left behind. Like I said, I think that funerals and rituals for the departed are for the living, not for the dead, because the dead don't care. They're not here anymore. It's not a part of what they're concerned with at that point. So on to animals, which was the other part of the question. My experience with the cow when I was in the cow energetically and they shot the cow and I was pulled out of with the cow and the cow died with its spirit and saw the great cowness that actually the goddess Hathor was there waiting for the cow, which I thought was interesting. Gave me that definite distinct impression that in the animal kingdom it's not like individual spirits going to their own place, but it's more the energy of the animal going to a place where all of them are together, and that's where instinct comes from. The cow actually remembered its life, which I thought was weird, but there it was. I'm like, really? Okay, as we were flying up into this thing, the cow is like reviewing its life and its death, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. So I think that the totality of all of their experiences gets collected in this. I don't know what to call it. I called that the cowness, and that every animal and plant has its own ness, as it were, which is its form of consciousness, but it's more of a collective instead of individual, like humans tend to be. And that's where instinct arises. Enough of them have the same bad outcome from the same activity. Eventually, they'll stop doing it because they want to not die. That seems to be the case. But I think that with the animals that we have as pets, like dogs and cats and so forth, that are connected to people in a strong way. Although I believe they still have that ness area like the other animals do. I think there's definitely room for them to have also individual spirits because of getting that from the people that they've been with. Otherwise, how can I explain my cat, who's buried in the backyard, just on the other side of the temple, across from me, coming into my room years after he passed and jumping up on my bed and purring and laying down next to me. The encounters that humans have had with their pets, more than one person for sure has seen a cat or a dog that they've been close to appear. And the only way that could happen would be if they had developed that kind of a slightly different energetic relationship with the people that they were with versus just being the animal. Like, the goose at the pond is probably not going to do that, or the sheep in the herd, or, whatever else, even though they're around people. But those who live with us that we have those strong empathic and energetic connections with, I think there's a probable yes. Because I certainly have encountered them. If I'm right, that's great. If I'm not, no one will be able to prove me wrong. It's kind of fun. But we get attached to them just as much as we do the people, sometimes more, because animals tend to be a lot more appreciative and a lot less judgmental. And they have fewer expectations of what we should do in our behavior. And they don't tell us what they are, except that they want to eat and they want to sleep and they want to be petted. And they're very clear when they want those things. And the rest of the time, they're going to hang out with us and follow us around if they're a dog and, get up on a high spot and watch us if they're a cat, whatever. So, quandaries about life and death are certainly something that humans throughout history have tried to answer the question about what to do and how to do it and so forth. And all the different ways we have of helping to process our subconscious or ways that can be adapted for this, like the cup transformation ritual, I think would be a good one when someone's going through a lot of grief and wants to move through it, by putting all of that into the cup and then changing that into something else like acceptance or joy or I don't know what. But yeah, something like that. So people light candles on certain days to remember the dead. We do that for a lot of things, not just for the dead, but for the living, for healing, and so forth, as a way to focus our minds and our attention. I think candle lighting is one of the things that does that. It's one of the reasons why so many religions do it. A pagan, Christian, it doesn't matter. The idea of going into a sacred place or sacred space and lighting the candle with intention, thinking about the person, either sending them energy for healing or sending them comfort because, they've passed away, or sending ourselves comfort because they've passed away. It's like to let them know we're thinking of them and whatever is a very human thing to do. And so it doesn't have to be specific to any religion or belief system. And certainly in the past, when we were more tribal, there was a lot of more community support. When someone in the tribe was gone, I'm sure that they had a lot of different methods that they used in order to try and help the ones who were left behind, because they now have a gap in their tribe, and everyone in a tribe had something important to contribute. And so then there's that kind of adjustment to be made. But then you're surrounded by people who know you. And we're a lot more isolated now. This is an amazing venue to be able to communicate with and reach out and touch people in different parts of the planet. I think it's awesome. Not the same as being with someone in person. It's not the same at all as a human touch and a hug. They're just words. And so if you're going through something, find someone that you can talk to. Definitely. And if someone tells you you shouldn't be upset and you shouldn't still be grieving, try not to be friends with them. or at least, minimize your contact with that person, because There's no rule book that says that after this many days, this many months, this many years, you should be over it. This is not something anyone ever gets over. You've known someone alive, vibrant, whether a human or a pet. You've interacted with them, you've made emotional connections with them, you've had experiences and shared memories with them, and all that stopped. So, yeah, I wish people would stop trying to help other people the wrong way instead of supporting them for where they're at and for what they're going through. And doesn't matter the subject. People are really willing to tell you what they think you should be doing. And hopefully you've figured out that I'll tell you what I know and what I've experienced and what I think, but I would never tell you how to go about doing it because that is entirely up to you. So hopefully this has somewhat answered the question that came in. And I know it's a bit of a somber subject, but it happens. And I look forward to any questions anyone else might have about the subject. And if you need support, find someone to give you emotional support. Find a group, an organization, a counselor, a grief therapist, whatever, family member, and don't go through this alone if you can. If you can avoid going through it alone, going through it with someone is easier, even if it's just for them to sit next to you and let you cry. So, this has been Siofra's Magic Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. Blessed be.